So when a man and woman have children, the reason they don't have a litter of clones, a litter of identical twins or triplets and so on, is because the genes get reshuffled. So even with the holding parents constant, the kids are going to inherit different combinations of genes, different subsets of genes. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of chance that goes into the wiring of the brain and the forming of the person. They're unique experiences that leave their stamp on a person in ways that we don't understand. There are sex differences. One's a boy, one's a girl. You can't tell with just one of each which of their traits are due to being male and female, but in large samples you can assess the probabilities, and there are some differences between boys and girls. Since each of them is an individual, it's hard for me, not knowing them and not being equipped to diagnose them, how to get them to communicate better. I don't know if I can offer much more than common sense. Let them interact, explain to each of them what might be different about the other, and hope that the natural course of events works out.
This emailer from Maine emailed in about, again, twin daughters, who, when they were young, he says, had a language all their own. They talk to each other. Have you studied anything?
I have studied language development in twins, although not these private languages. But I've done a little bit of reading on them, and I think every case that's been studied isn't really a separate language with its own words and grammar and so on. It's really a distorted pronunciation of parts of the language that they hear from their parents or babysitters. What happens is when you learn a language, you have to perfect its pronunciation by listening to other people. If you're spending a lot of time with a twin who might have a certain mispronunciation, which you then copy, and then he copies it from you, and you copy it from him, and he copies your copy of his copy, it can sometimes veer off into an idiosyncratic pronunciation, which typically children outgrow by the time they're 2 or 3. So it's misleading to call it a different language, but it often sounds like one because the pronunciations are idiosyncratic.
Is that the same type of thing? I mean, I know family members have said to me as an adult, you say that just like your mother did, and I hadn't lived with my mother for 25 or 30 years. And do we keep those kinds of memories of things that are said to us and the way they're said to us?
Generally, no, because accents are much more likely to conform to your peer group than your parents. And anyone who moves from, say, England to the U.S. or vice versa, or from the deep South to California, finds that the kids don't end up speaking like them. They're indistinguishable from their classmates. So generally, we don't. We're so attuned when we're kids to how other kids talk that's what we glom onto.
Next is San Francisco. Hello.
Hello. Thanks, Connie C-SPAN, for taking my call.
Sure.
Professor Pinker, earlier in the conversation, you were speaking about empty rhetoric, and I wanted to ask you about words that simultaneously activate multiple frames. There's a cognitive scientist at Berkeley, George Lakoff, who writes about concepts that have uncontested cores, and then they have contested conclusions or contested specificity. And I wanted to ask you, perhaps if you could talk about any examples of words or concepts that you've observed that are used in politics that sort of maybe apparently seem like throwaway language or empty rhetoric, but functionally they're words that are used sort of as double agents to try to speak to two or more sides of the electorate in different ways.
And if you could, broader than that, talk about George Lakoff's theories and how you have reacted and responded to them over the years.
Yes, well, Lakoff's a very influential and distinguished linguist and cognitive scientist, and he's certainly been an influence on a lot of my thinking. In The Stuff of Thought, I have a chapter called The Metaphor, largely influenced by Lakoff's work on how much of everyday speech is metaphorical without people even realizing that they're using metaphors. If I say our language is saturated with metaphor, well, saturated, it's like language is a sponge and its constructions are a kind of liquid. If I say, well, I've sometimes fought with Lakoff, I attacked his book and he defended himself, I'm using the metaphor of argument, intellectual argument, being kind of warfare. it's almost hard to find any example of language that is not metaphorical, and that must tell us something about how the mind works. Lakoff has written a number of books exploring that idea and applying it to politics. I think he goes much too far, but while acknowledging that he has shed an awful lot of light on human cognition in this way. In terms of particular examples, well, Lakoff chose the example of freedom in a book that I didn't much care for, but nonetheless made the significant point that freedom has different meanings to different people in different parts of the spectrum. For say the civil liberties-minded center-left and libertarians, it involves things like sexual orientation, choice in media, the ability to not have entertainment censored, to economic libertarians, it involves the ability to start a business and to run it unfettered by government regulations. To others, it just involves an opposition to tyranny and dictatorship, and it's a license for spreading democracy at the point of a gun to other countries, such as Iraq. So one word and one concept can actually be quite divisive when you start to implement it.
The other example you used in the book is taxes.
Taxes is another example. Professor Lakoff suggested that some of the stigma against taxes that conservative politicians have exploited can be lifted if you refer to taxes as membership fees, which I think has a certain tin ear to what kind of euphemism will actually work on people, and I think would immediately become a target of ridicule. So I don't think it's particularly astute political advice, although the more general point, I think, is valid, namely that the art of rhetoric and persuasion does consist often in framing the same concept in different ways. Hence, I mean, there are many examples when the movement to outlaw abortion was called pro-life. The movement to keep abortion legal and available is called pro-choice, where choice is something that, who could be against choice if you're a Democrat in favor of freedom, small d Democrat, that is. And so, but on the other hand, who could be against life? So each side picks one aspect of the phenomenon that is very hard to be opposed to and uses that as the brand for their political movement. Probably just about anything that serves as a catchword or a tagline for a political campaign can have these opposite meanings, change being the most obvious example in this particular campaign.
Melville, New York, hello.
Hello. Good afternoon. I'm reading a book, Life After Death, The Burden of Proof by Deepak Chopra, and I'm wondering, one of the premises of the book, The Burden of Proof, is, I guess, to prove the existence of a superior being, a mind, God. And he does cite some examples in neurological research about putting the mind before the brain, or the brain as the controller of the mind. And I'm wondering what you think about that, both of those philosophies.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't believe that there is any mind that's separate from the operation of the brain. So I think the studies that look at people who, say, have near-death experiences and have common accounts of what they experience as supposedly the soul leaves the body can all be explained in terms of the effects of oxygen deprivation on the brain, the kind of hallucinations that you have when the visual cortex is deprived of oxygen. And I don't think that any accounts of a person ceasing brain function and then being revived and then being able to remember conversations that took place when there was no brain activity, I don't think any of those have panned out. They all turn out to be false reports, cases where it would be very easy to reconstruct it after the fact. So I would have to disagree with the premise of the book. I haven't read it, but assuming that it's that mind can exist separately from brain, then I think the evidence is very strongly against that. I mean, the mind can affect the brain in the sense that the whole operation of the entire brain, which is very densely and richly interconnected, can affect certain parts of the brain. The mind can affect the